Hello, everyone. I'm Rosa Linda Román. I go by Rosa Linda, and this is my weekly reading of a chapter of my book, Losing Sight of the Shore, How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family. We have much more experience than we did even when I wrote this book because we are currently living on a boat with our family, this time in the Mediterranean. This book was written about the two catamarans we lived on in the Bahamas. But now we're on a boat in Spain. Past week in Mallorca, which was amazing. It's an island off the coast of Spain, and we made amazing friends and saw just beautiful anchorages. It was amazing. And you can see I'm a little more tan than I was in weeks past. We are now back in Barcelona, actually excited because we're going to have some friends coming from, just so happened to be celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary in Barcelona at the same time that we're here. So we're going to see some of our dear friends later this week. And in the meanwhile, we're trying to get all the boat projects squared away. We're super happy because the AC finally works. So my family is inside the cabin right now, very happy to have AC because it is a very, very hot time of year. Anyway, I wanted to share this week's chapter of my book. So here we go. Again, Losing Sight of the Shore, chapter 27, Making Music. The sounds of the sea are like music to my ears, and the very thing that draws me to her. Beyond that, music is a mystery to me. I'm not musically inclined in the slightest. For anyone who may doubt this, I will point to my wedding for evidence. It was October 10th, 1998, on a dude ranch south of Tucson, Arizona, called Rex Ranch. For months, I had been taking secret singing lessons in response to a comment my betrothed made at some point during our 10 months of wedding preps. He casually mentioned to someone that he had always wished his bride would sing to him at their wedding. We both laughed out loud, before the invention of LOLs, mind you, knowing there was no chance of that ever happening unless he married someone else, since I couldn't sing to save my life. Of course, being an overachiever in the wedding planning department, I decided to surprise him at our wedding. Looking back, I see that this plan was ill-advised given my singing ability, or lack thereof. But I guess when you are newly in love and planning a wedding, you just do crazy things. So it was that I stood before all of our family and friends and belted out my rendition of Shania Twain's You're Still the One at our wedding reception. My performance had the desired effect, and Nathan even got a bit choked up when I was singing to him that day. Afterwards, everyone said what a great job I did and how moved they were. Because let's face it, who's going to shame a bride at her own wedding? It wasn't until months later, when we were visiting Nathan's cousin in Taos, New Mexico, that I realized that perhaps my performance wasn't as smooth as I thought it was. In all seriousness, his cousin said, you could have used a few more lessons. I laughed without taking offense because I knew in my heart of hearts that he was absolutely right. Nathan knew it too. Now, some 20 years later, Nathan shares his love of music with his kids, but also shares a lack of musical abilities with his wife. In other words, we are not the best people to set a musical example for anyone. But as it turns out, my kids are all much more musically inclined than we are. As is the case with their various sports, we try hard not to let our dreams stand in the way of theirs, whether they are our dreams of living on a sailing catamaran, traveling the world, or some other wild hair dream that we may get. This presented a unique challenge when the pursuit of my dream, i.e. living on a boat, meant their only available teachers were two musically deficient parents. When we were back on land in New Mexico, this wasn't as big of a problem as it was on the boat. When we lived on land, we had access to teachers and instruments and the internet so that the kids' musical curiosity could be nurtured appropriately. I was not surprised that they liked music, as both Nathan's father, Sam, and his Aunt Fern played the piano more beautifully than I had ever heard anyone play before. Sadly, that talent skipped a generation. But when his father died, the kids inherited his beloved piano. We had it shipped from Tucson to New Mexico and found an amazing piano teacher not too far from our home. For several months leading up to our departure, Ahava and Ziva took their piano lessons with this wonderful teacher and learned enough to play some rudimentary songs on Grandpa Sam's piano. When we sailed away, it was with promises that I would try to set up some FaceTime lessons with Miss Suzette as soon as possible. Then life got busy and piano fell from our minds while we were moving and prepping the boat, and those FaceTime lessons never happened. We realized pretty quickly that Ziva seriously missed playing the piano and that we needed to come up with a plan. We didn't want all the learning to go to waste and for them to have to start all over at square one. For Hanukkah that first year, Ziva got a big surprise, an Alesis 88-key full-weighted keyboard, the closest thing to a real piano that you could get on a boat our size. Although she still had the problem of not having a teacher, at least she could play around on the keyboard and attempt to make some music. Then, once again, my life's mantra was proven true. If you get clear on what you want, the right people and resources show up to make it happen. We got clear that we needed musical mentors in our kids' lives, and then one after another, they showed up in the most unlikely places. The first time we realized that we could still introduce our kids to a love of music despite our location and personal music deficiencies was in one of the quietest anchorages we have ever been in, Hatchet Bay in Eleuthera, Bahamas on New Year's Day. As you approached this harbor, it didn't even look like there was an entrance anywhere along the wild, rocky shoreline. But by following the charts carefully, we eventually found a very thin channel flowing between jagged rock walls on either side. It was in that harbor that we had two of our all-time favorite boat schooling experiences. Fortunately, it is one of the very few journal entries I actually wrote in our daily cruising log. Here we go. Today we had a nice last day of Hanukkah and made some new friends. Above is the boat card for Captain Dave, which is how he introduced himself and how others refer to him, and Heather, who spend as much time as they can on the sailboat, the Answer My Friend. Also on board when we met them was a friend, Amy, who was visiting from Pennsylvania. We met Dave as we were returning to our dinghy after exploring the little town of Alistown beside Hatchet Bay, where our boat is anchored. We struck up a conversation and invited their crew over for breakfast the next day. It turned out to be the perfect way to start off the new year. The three arrived in their water-filled dinghy, and we weren't sure what to expect. But within minutes, we were all fast friends, giving them a tour of the boat and sitting down to breakfast. The couple proved to be a wealth of information for us about the Exumas and areas that we would like to explore. But perhaps the best part was when we headed over to their boat later that day for appetizers and a music jam. We brought homemade donuts, our attempt at sufganiot for Hanukkah. Nala's barking at the boat going by. And another boat neighbor, Richard from the Kelly Ray, brought popcorn. Then Amy and Captain Dave pulled out their guitars and started playing and singing. We all loved it. And it was great fun to explore their old boat and see the differences between being on a monohull and how we live on the Don Treader sailing catamaran. Reading this over now almost 2 years later, I have a flood of thoughts. First, I really wish that I had written more daily cruising log entries like this. They may not have been as thorough as I thought they should be, but even a quick overview type entry like this transports me back to that beautiful moment in time. If nothing else, but for memory's sake, it is definitely worth the effort. Reading over this journal entry takes me back to the feelings of that day. While I am far from a seasoned sailor by any stretch of the imagination, I am definitely more experienced than I was when we first pulled into Hatchet Bay almost 2 years ago. I now know that it was not that unusual for cruisers to invite each other to their boats for breakfast or a music jam. In fact, it's quite common and one of the reasons I love the lifestyle. Unlike on land, where we generally need a few weeks to plan a play date, On the water, we learn quickly that the interesting person in your anchorage might not be there the next week or even the next day. So social plans are made much more quickly and spontaneously. In some ways, your normal social awkwardness and hesitation goes out the window, and the results can be magical. That night, as the crew of The Answer, My Friend shared their songs with us, we got to witness that magic firsthand. Granted, that basic journal entry doesn't include the nuances of the experience or the unique challenges we sometimes face with kids on board. While the overwhelming experiences of our liveaboard life were positive and kid-friendly, there are definitely some sailors that are saltier, salty dogs, and so we always have to approach new social gatherings with a bit of caution. That night, when David and Heather started to play, they began with the appropriate filter for the audience, singing silly songs of the sea. Eventually, as the wine we brought flowed more freely, so did the lyrics, and we found ourselves listening to a song about a pig that was definitely not kid-friendly. In this case, it was all in good fun, and my kids are not easily traumatized by such things. But I do remember Miss Allie and I looking at each other uncomfortably and wondering, where exactly is this jam session going from here? Gratefully, the pig song was the only one that was objectionable that night. Despite the pig song discomfort, that night on The Answer, My Friend was amazing and a perfect example of how musical mentors found their way into our lives, even in the most remote places. The weather was rainy and a storm was moving in, but at that jam session, with the camaraderie and the music, everything felt cozy and warm. The kids were inspired by the performances, and I believe it set the stage for Ziva, in particular, to really redouble her efforts on her new piano keyboard. Still, being inspired to practice when she already knew what she already knew wasn't enough to keep the learning alive. For that, she needed a teacher. Unfortunately, for the next few months, there were no teachers around as we hopped from island to island. There was Wi-Fi from time to time, so she used a piano teaching website called Scoove, thanks to the free trial that came with her keyboard. This was just what she needed to keep from losing what she already knew, but not enough to make any major progress. It wasn't until a few months later, when we reached the cruising mecca of Georgetown in the Exumas, that more musical mentors could be found. Like so many other great discoveries that we made in Georgetown, we found Ziva's next piano teacher with the help of the VHF radio and the daily Georgetown Cruisers Net. One desperate morning, frustrated with her frustration and wanting so badly to help her explore her love of learning music, I got on the Cruisers Net and said, "This is Rosa Linda on the Dawn Treader. I'm looking for a piano teacher for my daughter. She has a piano keyboard on board, and we would love to hire someone to come and teach her a little more." At first, there was no response, but later that day, we got a call on VHF Channel 68. Dawn Treader, this is Lady Bess." To which I responded, as usual, "This is Dawn Treader. Can we go to 6-9 and up?" 6-9 and up. Once we were on Channel 69, introductions were made, and we learned that the caller was a young man named Isaiah, anchored in the harbor, who said, "My buddy and I like to jam sometimes." I wasn't sure if that was really what we were looking for. After all, could a young kid whose only credentials seemed to be that he and his buddy liked to jam really help teach my daughter piano? But since he was the only one who had responded, I figured I'd better invite him over anyway. Boy, am I glad I did. I'm not sure if it is a trait of all musically inclined cruisers, but Isaiah also arrived to the Dawn Treader in a water-filled, deflated, sad-looking dinghy. Nala went nuts when she saw this bedraggled-looking, bearded, long-haired sailor approaching our boat in that suspicious-looking dinghy. But she and we quickly fell in love with this young man. His story was pretty much the opposite of ours. He was 18 years old and had solo sailed from Canada to the Bahamas on a tiny little boat named Lady Bess. Well, we had a piano keyboard, ice maker, water maker, washer and dryer, and many other modern conveniences aboard the Dawn Treader. He didn't even have a refrigerator on that 26-foot monohull. While we went to a marina to fill up our water tanks or headed out to sea to fire up the water maker if needed, he was probably sitting in that little dinghy for hours each week to fill up jerry cans at the local spigot behind the grocery store. On the Dawn Treader, when we wanted to get clean at the end of a long day, we could just choose between the 3 different full-size showers with hot water at the ready in moments. For him, a shower likely meant scrubbing himself in salt water and rinsing with a cup. In other words, he was not living large. But if he felt like he was lacking in life, you would never know it from his joyful nature and generous spirit. That young man arrived at our boat smelly and ready to play. Here is how Ziva remembers it. We had the piano for a while, but I wasn't really playing much. One day we called on the radio, actually you did, without my permission, asking if anyone could teach me piano. So a guy answered and he came over. You guys made him take a shower. Well, I think we never made him take a shower, but suggested privately, or maybe we didn't tell him. Anyway, we wanted him to take a shower, but he didn't. But I still worked with him, even though he was stinky. And he started teaching me the songs he had learned by ear. He couldn't really read music, but he played really well. He taught me some Billy Joel songs like Piano Man and Part of Georgia. That's Ziva's rendition. In addition to giving us a glimpse into the different ways we remember an event, we apparently all remember the stinky part, and we also all remember him fondly. Ziva's account reminds me of the challenges of making things work along the way, for the many different personalities in a family. The fact that she remembers that I made that call without her permission is very telling. I definitely remember it differently. So often in this life with kids, we have to make tough calls that are not popular, but which they thank us for later. It is why parenting is sometimes considered such a thankless job, and why I realize I owe my own parents more than I could ever repay for helping me become who I am today. Like the piano lessons, hopefully in the end, my kids will remember our adventures fondly, even if there are some stinky or questionable parts along the way. Helping the kids learn to play piano wasn't the only way that music enhanced our liveaboard lives. When we bought her, the Dawn Treader was already equipped with a sound system, complete with a CD player and speakers in the main salon and on deck, and we promptly put them to good use. It turns out, on a rainy day in a tiny cabin, nothing brings in the sunshine like a dance party to the Trolls movie soundtrack with its old is new again songs like Lionel Richie's Hello or True Colors with Justin Timberlake and Anna Kendrick. And when it comes time to encourage the kids while scrubbing the deck or cleaning their cabins, you can't go wrong with the soundtrack from the movie Home, with peppy beats from Rhiannon and J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez. If either of those failed, we could always pull out the soundtracks from Moana, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, or Frozen. In other words, there were a lot of singing animals and animated characters along for the ride. Of course, no chapter on the soundtrack of our liveaboard life would be complete without talking about the island jam sessions we were privileged to be a part of over the years. 2 of my favorites both happened in Hopetown when we were living on Hakuna Matata. The first was at my friend Rachel's house. She and her husband are pretty much on the opposite side of the musical spectrum from Nathan and me. They play instruments and have beautiful singing voices. Together with their 2 daughters, they perform in festivals and Christmas plays, and music is just a natural part of their lives. Because of this, they frequently host jam sessions with their friends. These might be at their home, which is called Mussy Dreamin', on the beach, or at a quirky bar on a nearby island called Cracker Peas. Rachel comes from a musical family with a father who gained some fame for his reggae CDs, and she is the kind of person that seems to have music flowing out of her heart and into the world. I would later learn that there are a lot of people like that on many Bahamian islands. But when I first met Rachel, it was so new to me and I was drawn to it. The rhythms reminded me of my most favorite childhood memories, which I now realize also involved music. Writing this, I am drawn back to my past. Long before I lived on a boat, long before piano lessons and beach jams to another time when I resisted my own musical awkwardness and let the music move me. Perhaps it is an island thing, or an island thing, as they would say in the Bahamas, but music was always a major part of my father's life on his native Puerto Rico. For no particular reason, he and his brothers and sisters might break out a guiro, cuatro, or maracas and have a jam session on my abuela's front porch. This is actually the main reason I wanted to sail to Puerto Rico, not just to reconnect to my roots, but to share that musical magic with my children firsthand. For me, the pinnacle of this joyful musical tradition happened on the eve of Dia de los Tres Reyes Magos, or Three Kings Day, a celebration in Puerto Rico known as parrandas. Even as I type the words, I hear the song beginning in my head. Saludos, saludos, vengo a saludar. Saludos, saludos, vengo a saludar. Before I tell you the way these parrandas worked, I will put the caveat on it that this is how they worked in my memory. I was probably Ziva's age, 11, when I first attended a parranda, and it left a lasting impression on me. Rather than trying to Google it, as the good journalist I am, to ensure that I make this technically accurate in other people's eyes, I just want to write it as I remember it. So if you happen to be reading this and have a different experience, that is wonderful. This is just my personal perspective on a Puerto Rican parranda. The holiday, the holiday season in the mountain community of Lares, where my family lives, was nothing like the Christmases I was used to growing up in a typical American home in the Chicago suburbs. At home, we would decorate a Christmas tree and then eagerly await the mountain of presents from Santa Claus on Christmas morning. In Puerto Rico, I don't remember any Christmas trees, but I do remember women gathering in Abuela's kitchen to start the work-intensive process of making pasteles. When I was a kid, I didn't really like pasteles much, but now that I'm grown, I love those banana leaf wrapped, meat and potato filled, pasty culinary treasures. Now a grown up and a no pork eating Jewish one at that, I choose not to indulge in the other part of the holiday tradition of lechon, or a roast pig, but I still have vivid memories of my dad and his brothers choosing that year's swine, seeing the poor creature roasting over a fire, and the disgusting sausage making process that was happening in the kitchen. Still, despite the unpleasant parts, which did also include a few drunk relatives behaving badly, these memories are overwhelmingly wonderful. I don't remember much else about the holiday prep other than the year that my mom brought little gifts for all the cousins and the neighbors' kids and was received as if she were Mrs. Claus herself. The crossover of my two family traditions between my German, Irish, American mom and Puerto Rican papi's extended families is much more pronounced now, and I suspect that Christmas looks more like a traditional American household around the island than the simple way things looked back then. Gratefully, the parrandas live on. In fact, after Hurricane Maria devastated the island of Puerto Rico on September 20th of 2017, a lot of people returned to the island to take part in and revitalize the tradition. Back at my abuela's house 30 plus years ago, my siblings and I were smelling the smells from the kitchen and hearing the dominoes clickety-clacking back and forth from the living room. Suddenly, there was a new sound competing with the comadres and compadres conversations. Quiet at first, but getting louder by the minute, until finally it compelled us to step outside onto the porch to see what it was. There on the lawn down below stood my Tío Jimmy with his family and several of their neighbors. They had instruments in hand and were singing in our direction. Along with the strumming of the cuatro, the shaking of the maracas, and the whisking of the guido, I never know how to say that, guido, they sang, Saludos, saludos, vengo a saludar. Saludos, saludos, vengo a saludar. Loosely translated, that means something like, greetings, greetings, I come to greet you. The crowd sits there for a while to get everyone's attention, singing this song and getting louder and louder. Pretty soon they move into the next part, which is a la sarandela, and goes something like this. Ábreme la puerta. I'm not going to even sing this one because I don't know the tune. Ábreme la puerta, que estoy en la calle, y dirá a la gente que esto es un desaire, y dirá a la gente que esto es un desaire, which translates to something like, open the door for me, because I'm out here in the street, and people will say that this is a sight or a slight. On paper, in my embarrassing attempt at translation, it doesn't sound like much. But believe me that when everyone is joyfully singing and playing their instruments, the effect is pure magic. The next thing you know, you are gathering your own instruments along with everyone else in your house and heading out to join the crowd as they start moving the party up the street to your neighbor's house. This is what the parranda is all about. Starting at one house and then little by little walking through the pueblo and gathering your neighbors, family and friends until you have a massive group full of energy and ready for a party. The way I understand it, at least in the remote mountain community where my family lives, you set out on this parranda not knowing which house the party will end up at. So everyone is stocked and ready to receive the revelers in case it ends up at their house. Although, admittedly, this may be just the filter of a child's memory, but I don't see how they knew where to have the roasting pig ready for the hungry masses. Regardless of the many details I have certainly long forgotten, I will never forget the way this celebration felt in my heart. The parranda crowd, I remember most fondly, started for us at my abuela's house before sunset and slowly wound its way from house to house through a few miles of country roads. It was dark outside long before we reached our destination, perhaps the darkest I had ever experienced. And still the joy and the singing and the music continued along those mountain roads. The only thing louder was the call of the coqui, Puerto Rico's beloved tree frog that spends each night chirping, coqui, coqui, coqui. If ever I felt connected to my father's homeland, it was in that moment, walking beside him and the rest of our family in the dark. That night was one I will never forget. The parranda landed at my bisabuelo's house, that of my great-grandparents, Agustin and Mariana. Even then, as I watched the amazing, sexy Puerto Rican couples salsa dancing across the floor, I was painfully aware of how rhythmically challenged I was. Oh, how I longed to dance and play music the way they did. Part of me wanted to shrivel up and hide so that no one could see how this blondie, in my youth, non-Spanish speaking, two left-footed girl didn't fit in, but a bigger part of me wanted to jump in with wild abandon. That night, I landed somewhere in the middle, and I am proud to say that I did learn the very basic merengue dancing from my father and was brave enough to get out on the dance floor for a few minutes at least. Really, with music like that, I had no choice. It was joyously infectious. The music just filled you up and wouldn't let you go until you started moving. And once you started, you just couldn't stop. 30 or so years later, I discovered that same feeling in the Bahamas at Junkanoo. If you have never experienced a Junkanoo, you should definitely add it to your bucket list. And if you have already been a part of one, and I'm talking about the real Junkanoos here, not the ones you might see at Atlantis Resort or some other tourist area, then I know you are already thinking about how you can find a way to do it again. When a Junkanoo band makes its way through town with their steel drums and cowbells, it is incredibly powerful. Like the Pied Piper compelling the children to join him, when you hear these rhythms, you forget that you really can't dance, and you take to the streets to join the fun. We first learned about Junkanoo from a man named Junior at the marina we were docked at on Elbow Key, the same guy that made latkes for our Hanukkah party. While Nathan flew back and forth for work, Hakuna Matata was docked at Sea Spray Marina, which was on the opposite end of the island from the center of Hopetown. Back then, I was always in search of a good story for my video podcast, New Mexicast, and I always had my video camera in hand to record some of my favorite parts of island life. As the colorful holiday season approached, I started seeing signs about Junkanoo popping up around town. I asked Junior, Sea Spray's dockmaster, if he would let me interview him about Junkanoo, and he graciously agreed. That's when I got a great education about a tradition that I truly knew nothing about. Here's how Junior explained Junkanoo to me during that interview. Junkanoo originated from the old slavery days, when the slave masters would give the slaves 2 free days to themselves to practice their tribal folklore and culture. The slave that fought for that was named Johnny Canoe. They would sit under the big fig trees and bang on their big drums at the time. And it was basically their tribal music that they were used to. When slaves gained their freedom back in the 18th century, Emancipation Day, which is celebrated August the 1st every year, the tradition stayed alive. And so that's where we get the name Junkanoo from, which was derived from Johnny Canoe. Also, too, a point that I should make is that our famous Bahamian beer, Kalik, has a lot to do with Junkanoo. The cowbells that they shake in the parade, makes the famous sound like Kalik, 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 Kalik. And supposedly, after 3 or 4 Kaliks, that's the sound that you hear in your head. His description definitely made me want to go see a Junkanoo for myself. But a true Junkanoo isn't necessarily a kid-friendly tradition, and I was struggling over whether or not to take my kids to the late night celebration. Not just because it would be happening around midnight on New Year's Eve and way past their bedtimes, but also because there would be plenty of drinking and grown-up, half-naked dancing. Still, I wanted the kids to get the chance to feel moved by the music the way I did all those years earlier in Puerto Rico. Fortunately for us, right around that time, some of the parents decided to put together a daytime, more kid-friendly junior Junkanoo for all the island kids. The minute I heard about the junior Junkanoo that was being planned, I knew I wanted my daughters to join in the parade, or more accurately, the Junkanoo Rush. We gathered in the community center to make homemade costumes and noisemakers, and I soaked in the joy of community and companionship. One of my friends, Erica, who helped organize Junior Junkanoo, agreed to let me interview her as she worked on the costumes for her kids. Here's what she said when I asked her why it was so important to her. The only way we can keep culture and tradition alive is to instill it in our kids. I mean, because they're the ones that are up and coming, and you don't want that to fade away. You know, so to speak, you don't want to become a dying art. You know, like we see so many things throughout the Abacos, boat building, the original wooden boat building, no one stepped up to the plate. It's like young kids to join into that. And it seems that wooden boat builders are just slowly fading out. We don't want that to happen to Junkanoo. As I sat there with these wonderful women, hot gluing brightly colored feathers to cardboard box cutout headdresses, I knew the junior Junkanoo would be a lot of fun for the kids, but I had no idea how much fun it would be for me and the other adults too. Since that junior Junkanoo, I have also been to 3 grown-up Junkanoos, the one at Sea Spray that New Year's Eve, another with my friend in Marsh Harbor, and years later the more touristy version at the Atlantis Resort in Nassau. Still, none can compare with that first junior Junkanoo for the joy it brought to my heart and the way it brought me back to the music of my roots. You just can't stay still at a Junkanoo. To quote Erica once again, impossible, impossible. There's an old saying that if it's done right and long enough, it can actually raise the dead. No doubt about that. It just has a certain way of just really, you just feel a part. There's no way to just stand there and ignore it. It's impossible. You just can't. For this rhythmically challenged Boricua, Puerto Rican, discovering new ways to share joyful celebrations like parrandas and Junkanoos with my kids is definitely music to my ears. And that is chapter 27, Island Music, Making Music of Losing Sight of the Shore. My book, my memoir about living on a sailing catamaran in the Bahamas and the United States. We sailed the entire east coast of the United States. I wanted to mention that we just got back from Mallorca, and one of my friends who was making the costumes with her 3 kids at that junior Junkanoo, her name's Michelle, she lives in Mallorca. And so we just spent time getting to re-meet her daughter, who is now 19 and connecting with Michelle. So thank you so much for coming out and meeting us, Michelle, if you're seeing this. Still in touch with all those wonderful island ladies to this day. And it just really warms my heart to know that we make friends wherever we go. So I really appreciate you listening. I've had 2 very long chapters the last 2 weeks, but it's what's on my heart, and I really appreciate you sharing. If you want more and you want to go back and read some of these chapters, well, certainly you can buy the book if you would like. But I also share them on my Substack. All of that is in the show notes here on this episode. All right. I will see you again next Tuesday, same time, same place. And I really appreciate you. That's it for now. Bye.